My first prediction actually is expect the unexpected. A good vision plans for the future has to be resilient, flexible enough to absorb shocks. And we've heard some of those themes already this morning. A city requires a large, complex infrastructure, and it's vulnerable to shocks. We saw some of that in the last few weeks with New York City and Sandy. New York City has about 8 million people in 360 square miles. Manhattan has 2 million people in about 20 square miles. There is, just to state the obvious, there is no food produced in New York City. If you want to feed those 8 million people, you need to figure out how to bring into the city each day about 3,000 calories of food per person. You need to bring in water per person, everything. And by the way, just an example of the vulnerability of the system, there's exactly one water pipe into Manhattan. We're now in the process of building a second one. But there is actually only one major water main coming down the spine of Manhattan. The second one will be completed, I think, in about 2 years. So these systems are vulnerable. Quick factoid, New Orleans, 5 years after Katrina was in 2005, 5 years later the population was still down 25%. So what are some things that could go very wrong? And I'm going to talk, and we've all talked about the trend to urbanization, but what are some things that could change all of that? Climate change. If I happen to be one of the people who think climate change is real, it could conceivably result in catastrophic, very sudden climate change. Most cities are based near a major body of water. If they're not based near a major body of water, well, they actually require fresh water to operate. Often that fresh water comes from some type of rain runoff. Again, I'm not going to claim I know exactly which cities in the world are vulnerable, but I will tell you that a city is vulnerable to those sorts of disruptions. Other things, political. I'll talk, and we have all talked, I think, a lot about urbanization in China, which I do think will be the trend. But realize China in the next 40 years is going to have to go through some very major transitions. It is going to face some interesting internal political transitions. It has a one-child policy. At some point, that has to end. If you look at what could be happening in China, civil war, strife, these are all possibilities. You could see an externally far more aggressive China. There's a wonderful, this is paraphrased from Professor Ferguson at Harvard via Karl Marx. Everyone heard of the expression, religion is the opiate of the masses? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nell's rephrasing of that is, if religion is the opiate of the masses, jingoism and nationalism is the cocaine of a rising middle class or a challenged political elite. It's not that hard to imagine future scenarios where countries such as China, India, Nigeria, Brazil, Pakistan, or any other list of countries is facing internal problems because of urbanization, stresses, political transitions, and chooses to deal with those problems by taking an aggressive foreign policy. And that could have a lot of issues. US policy in the 1950s was actually to try and somewhat tilt people away from urban centers. We were worried about nuclear war. Whether that happens again, whether governments start thinking about that, interesting issue. Post 9/11, and this was a tension for the city, the federal government wanted redundant backup facilities in certain banking and service areas, and it wanted those facilities at least 50 miles away from New York City. On one level, I fully understand why the government wanted that. If you're New York City, telling our major employers to move things away from New York City, not what you want to hear. So with those caveats, I still think we're going to see the continued triumph of the cities. I just wanted to flag there may be some bumps on the road. This was already touched on today. Africa and Asia are predominantly rural. The numbers I had were around 40% for those two areas living in urban settlements. By 2050, the UN was estimating 65%. I'm not here to argue it's good or bad, but what I will say is you're going to be seeing several hundred million people moving into megacities, cities that frankly don't have the correct infrastructure for the people they already have. There is going to be a huge need to build housing, sewer, schools, and transports. Actually, though, if you look at it, we're the mirror image of that. most of our infrastructure and transport, or most of our infrastructure, was built late 19th century, early 20th century. The developing world is now going through what we did in the late 19th century. And by the way, the growth rates for New York City, Boston, et cetera, were really actually quite staggering at the end of the 19th century. I alluded to that water tunnel. It was put in the late 19th century. It's made of wood. It's drilled through rock and a wood frame. New York City is having to go through those renovation projects. I actually think the Boston T is a lovely system, but parts of it are pretty antiquated. So if you're in China, you're looking at having to go build a transit system from scratch. If you're in the United States, you're looking at the transit system you built 100 years ago and saying, yeah, I guess this needs to be replaced. Different problems, but still problems. But there are some advantages to being in the developing world. Has anyone here, New Delhi recently opened a new airport within about the last 3 years or so. Anyone seen that, have been in that airport? It's a stunning airport, trust me. I've been there. I actually flew from there to Newark. Newark looks pathetic compared to this airport. It is not what you would think of as being the airport of a third world country. It is the airport of a 21st century country. There are some real advantages to building things from scratch. I mean, they had a very old, antiquated airport. It was busting at the seams. Society agreed we have to go build something, and they built something, and they could build it from scratch. But with all the stresses, all the issues around urban poverty, I do think we're going to continue to see a trend towards urbanization. Hypothesis, rising prosperity leads to demand for services that really come best in a city. Intellectual, cultural, education, medical. Mechanically, they're often best provided in a city due to the need for a large catchment area. A wonderful museum like the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, it needs to be centered in an area that has a few million people around it to come in. And for people, as they get more affluent who want those types of activities, they're going to want to be in cities. As the developing world does the shift from industry to service, and I believe they're going to, services tend to be urban. Climate change, leading to carbon taxes and conservation, generally speaking, favors cities. Cities are simply a lot more energy efficient. And how do I put it? On the one hand, a large city, as I noted, is vulnerable to climate change, but it's also easier to protect. It costs, again, I use the example of New York City. On the one hand, you do have 2 million people living in 20-odd square miles. On the other hand, the entire circumference of Manhattan is about 24 square miles. It's actually not that expensive to go raise the water bumpers by about a foot. If you have to do that all along the eastern seaboard of the United States, it's a lot more expensive. So in some ways, cities are easier to protect. Topic of megacities has already been touched on. The US, I think we're going to be seeing much more focus outwards. We're going to be shrinking as a share of the global economy. As we look at our cities, New York, 1/2 of the workforce of New York City was born outside of the US. We are going through an immigration boom in this country, which is actually in some ways comparable to what happened in the 19th century. For a lot of reasons, cities tend to attract immigrants far more so than rural areas. So the trends we're seeing at the country level are going to disproportionately happen at the urban level. In terms of maybe some other broader predictions, thinking about the world as a whole, and again, some of these we've already touched on, so I'll go through them quite quickly. By 2050, global population is expected to be 9 billion, up from 7 billion today. China, India, and the USA will be the world's largest economies. For the first time in 100 years, the United States will be, at best, the world's second largest economy. And that actually matters a lot, because for most of the last 100 years, if you were an American industry or sector, if you were the leader in the US, you were almost by definition a global leader, because you were in the biggest market. So we had the economies of scale. And just to give you an interesting factoid, in 2011, auto production in China was 18 million units, 18 million cars, trucks. In the US, it was 8.7 million. In the auto industry, we're already just a regional market. And by the way, 30 years ago, there was almost no auto production in China. And let's take that another step. When the U.S. is no longer the center of the economic world, what will it be like for cities? Will they feel less global? And let's look a little bit at Boston. Apologies. One of the major sectors in Boston is the great educational institutions. Boston University, Harvard, MIT, Northeastern. BU, Harvard, and MIT all aspire to be global institutions. A significant portion of their student body is foreign. A significant portion of the faculty is foreign. Well, they all want to be here because, the U.S. is where you want to be. Right now, of the world's top 10 universities by rankings, of the world's top 10 universities, 10 of them are American. Well, if the U.S. is the world's second largest economy, and a lot of the growth and excitement's happening in Asia, I'm going to make a bet that there'll be some Chinese universities and Indian universities in that top 10 list, and that we're going to move down. So what does that start meaning for a city like Boston? Swinging back, really just some quick factoids on the U.S., and this goes to the demographic transition we're going to be going through. U.S. population is going to go from about 300 million to 435 million by 2050. About 80% of that increase is coming from immigrants or U.S. or their U.S.-born descendants. By 2050, about 1 in 5 Americans will be an immigrant. That compares to about 1 in 8 today. And that will surpass the peak we reached actually in the 19th century immigration boom. The Latino population, which is already our largest minority group, will triple in size and be about 30% of the U.S. population. The U.S. elderly population will double in size by 2050. Dependency ratio, the number of children and elderly per working population, goes from 60 per 100 to 72 per 100. And I'm mentioning this because if I had to offer a hypothesis about cities, they're going to be at the forefronts of these trends. As I said, immigrants, at least in our experience, have tended to like urban areas. So it's going to be even more distinctly, the cities have large concentrations of immigrants. At least some hypothesis that elderly will find it easier to operate in a city, that it has access to the sorts of cultural institutions, et cetera, that people in that age group want to be dealing with. So you can see the cities are going to be reshaped in that way. Last point about the U.S., and this may be true in other countries, but it's certainly a U.S. point. I think there's going to be an increasing sort of structural tension between the cities and the more rural areas. If you look at the economics of the United States, a lot of the economic value add is in the urban areas. It basically subsidizes much of the rest of the country. At the same time, because of some of the ways the voting works, voting blocks work, et cetera, it's not always clear that there is the same level of political support. The myth of the family farmer has a lot of appeal. The myth of the rural homestead, and I think you're going to see a lot of tension because there's going to be a need for a huge amount of money to retrofit the urban areas, and it's not clear how willing the rest of the country is going to be to make the adjustments that are necessary. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.